There are mornings in Oxford when the air itself feels like glass, fragile, cold, and faintly luminous. That particular December day, the frost had crept as far as the parapets of Magdalen Tower, turning its stone into something crystalline and untouchable. I remember standing at the edge of High Street, my breath ghosting in front of me, and wondering, rather aimlessly I suppose, how beauty manages to persist in a city that has forgotten how to love anything without irony. A bus shuddered past, scattering a group of students wrapped in scarves of every conceivable shade of collegiate loyalty. I envied their noise, their certainty. For me, Oxford had long since lost that kind of clarity. I'd come to see it instead as a collection of facades, some carved in stone, others made of intellect and charm, each concealing something slightly more disappointing behind it. I was heading toward the Bodleian, not for work, but for comfort, if one can call it that. The smell of old paper, the quiet rustle of scholars who still cared about commas or about God, all of it soothed me in ways no doctor ever could. And yet even then, before Lewis found me later that afternoon, there was a sense of something suspended in the air, like a chime half struck. It was the newspaper kiosk that first turned the morning. I bought a copy without intention, more to occupy my hands than my mind, and glanced at the front page while the vendor counted my change. The headline was small, discreet, tucked into the corner where tragedies less photogenic are sent to fade. Academic found dead after choir practice at Magdalen College. I read the words twice, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to hear how they sounded in silence. Professor Lionel Hargreaves, a man whose name I'd seen occasionally attached to footnotes in obscure journals about 17th century poetry. He had once, I recalled, delivered a paper on Donne's metaphysical conceits that I had found unreadable, yet curiously sincere. Now he was dead, slipped, apparently, on the icy steps after evensong. The story was half a column long. Nothing suspicious, it said, nothing of note. But something in the phrasing troubled me. After choir practice, not after the service, nor on his way home. It was too precise, as if someone had chosen the words carefully to sound casual. That kind of precision, in my experience, never belonged to accidents. I folded the paper and carried it with me like a reluctant companion. By the time I reached Radcliffe Square, the frost had begun to thaw, leaving small, glistening rivulets along the cobblestones. A bell tolled somewhere beyond All Souls, and for a moment I imagined Hargreaves hearing that same bell the night before, its note lingering just long enough for him to misstep, or for someone to offer him a hand that withdrew too soon. I've always distrusted the easy narrative of misfortune. Death, particularly in Oxford, rarely happens without a touch of intention. The city breeds too much vanity, too much competition, and far too much silence between people who ought to speak. Later, when Lewis mentioned the case over coffee, he did so with a kind of half-hearted politeness reserved for things he already knew would interest me. "Another Don," he said. "Another fall." I asked him whether the man sang in the choir. He nodded, puzzled. They said he had a fine baritone. Then he added, as if by afterthought, that the college chaplain seemed oddly evasive about the timing of events. Timing. The simplest thing in the world, and yet the hardest to get right. A slip, a step, a silence too long, everything unravels from there. That evening, as I walked back along the High, I glanced again at Magdalen Tower. Its frost shimmered faintly in the lamplight, like old glass holding on to the day's last reflection. Somewhere within, a choir rehearsed. The sound was distant, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but one note, just one, wavered out of key. And I remember thinking then, before I ever set foot inside the college, that something in Oxford's perfect symmetry had cracked, and that I would spend the coming weeks listening for where the discord began. It was Lewis who first noticed how clean the staircase was. No scuff marks on the treads, no grit on the landing, nothing to suggest a man had slipped there, let alone fallen to his death. I stood a few steps above him, looking down, and thought how death, when it happens neatly, tends to smell of rehearsal. The choir master, Dr. Ellison, met us at the porter's gate, a tall, gracious man whose voice carried the soft erosion of years spent conducting. He led us through cloisters that seemed to hum faintly, even in silence. The air was sharp with the scent of polish and candle wax. He spoke gently, carefully, the way one might speak to a child about music. Measured pauses, impeccable diction. He said that Hargreaves had left the practice late, sometime after 9, and that the accident must have occurred on the east stair by the chapel. Lewis asked the obvious things. Whether anyone saw it happen, whether Hargreaves had been drinking, whether there was any quarrel that evening. Ellison smiled with the detachment of a man who has mastered sorrow as a performance. None that I'm aware of, he said, though there had been a mild disagreement about a choral arrangement. Don's nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day. He added that Hargreaves had been unusually insistent on altering the final stanza. That interested me more than I let on. Don's poem, one of his darkest meditations on death, ends with the idea of rebirth through faith, yet it was precisely that stanza Hargreaves had wanted omitted. I asked whether Ellison had agreed to the change. He looked away, towards the frost-glazed window, and said it was too late in the term for alterations. His fingers, resting on the piano lid, drummed a silent rhythm. The choir boys drifted in after rehearsal, their voices still warm from song. They glanced at us with that uneasy curiosity children reserve for authority. One of them, a fair-haired boy called Benson, muttered something about hearing the two men arguing near the organ loft before the fall. Ellison corrected him softly. Discussion, not argument. But Benson's face held the stubborn certainty of someone who knows the difference. Lewis jotted notes in his book. I watched Ellison instead. There was a thin line of chalk dust along his sleeve, a conductor's habit. When he folded his arms, it vanished under the dark wool of his gown, as if the evidence of creation was something to be hidden. I asked him whether the professor had any reason to be in the tower after rehearsal. He said Hargreaves liked to watch the frost form on the parapet, as if beauty could be measured by endurance. We walked through the chapel once more before leaving. The pews glimmered faintly in the low light. I paused at the lectern and noticed the choir's sheet music left open on the stand. The notation was meticulous, but one word in the text had been erased and rewritten in a different hand. Sleep, replaced by silence. A small alteration, almost invisible beneath the smudge of ink. Lewis was already at the door when I copied it into my notebook. I told him it was nothing, merely a textual curiosity, yet it lingered with me, the way certain wrong notes do long after the music stops. Outside, the frost had thickened. Across the quad, the choir boys' laughter scattered like brittle glass. Ellison stood at the entrance, watching us go. He said it was a terrible misfortune, of course, and hoped the investigation would confirm what everyone already believed, that it was an accident. I nodded, though I had already decided it wasn't. Not because of the fall, nor the frost, but because men like Ellison rarely hope for confirmation. They expect it. And expectation, in Oxford, is almost always the first lie. That night in my flat, I unfolded the sheet of paper I'd taken from the lectern. The inked word, silence, seemed to shimmer faintly in the lamplight, as if rewritten not for music, but for meaning. I poured a measure of whiskey, and somewhere between one sip and the next, I began to wonder whether Don's poem had been chosen for the season, or for the guilt it might conceal. The first time I met Claire Redding, she stood at the edge of the choir stalls, with the air of someone who had already decided not to belong. The late morning light was falling through the stained glass in narrow blades, cutting her face into fragments of red and blue. She didn't move when I approached, just watched the dust drift between us as though measuring how much of herself she was prepared to reveal. She told me she was a visiting music scholar, temporarily attached to Magdalen, studying the metaphysical poet's influence on early choral compositions. Her voice carried that faint cadence of someone born far from Oxford, northern perhaps, but educated enough to conceal it. There was, too, a subtle tremor when she spoke of Professor Hargreaves, one that seemed less grief than restraint. She said she had last seen him alive the evening of the rehearsal, though she did not attend it herself. "A migraine," she said, glancing away toward the chapel ceiling. Lewis, ever the polite skeptic, asked about her connection to the professor. "A mentor," she said. "No more." Her hands were clasped tightly around a folded handkerchief, white linen stained faintly with ink. It wasn't the gesture of a mourner. It was the gesture of someone hiding evidence of thought. Later, I met Fiona Hale in the college garden, a younger woman, one of the altos. She had a quick smile, the sort that appeared too easily to be entirely genuine. She spoke freely of Hargreaves, admiration, respect, a touch of envy. He had, she said, been on the verge of publishing a controversial paper concerning authorship in 17th century hymnals. Her tone suggested she knew more than she admitted, though perhaps less than she pretended. When I asked about Claire, Fiona's smile faltered. "A fine mind," she said, "but inclined toward melodrama." There had been talk, naturally. Hargreaves and she were close, too close for some tastes. Fiona shrugged then, a gesture rehearsed to look careless. I noticed a faint smudge of ink on her wrist, the same shade as Claire's handkerchief. Scholars are like cats, I thought. They all step in the same spilled ink, but pretend their paws are clean. That afternoon in the choir room, I examined the program drafts for the concert that never took place. 2 versions. One written in Hargreaves's neat hand, the other annotated by someone else. The second replaced the word eternal with enduring in a Donne verse. It was an alteration so slight that no one without a poet's ear or a detective's melancholy would have noticed. But Donne's distinction mattered. Eternal spoke of faith, enduring of persistence without grace. It was a linguistic betrayal, elegant and deliberate. As I walked back through the cloisters, the choir was rehearsing under another conductor. Their voices echoed between stone walls, pure but without conviction. I thought of Claire again, the way her eyes flinched at the word mentor, and of Fiona's tone, so bright it bordered on defensive. There was a triangle here, but not the romantic kind. It was something colder, intellectual possession, perhaps the cruelest intimacy of all. That evening, I stopped by the King's Arms. The whiskey was indifferent, the company non-existent. I unfolded the program sheet and stared at the single correction, enduring, a word chosen by someone who feared loss but had no faith in resurrection. I thought of Claire's trembling voice, Fiona's smile, and Hargreaves' death beneath a tower that sang for him even after he was gone. Lewis asked later whether I thought jealousy might explain it. I told him jealousy was too easy. Oxford's crimes, I said, are rarely emotional. They are grammatical. Someone had edited a man's life the way one edits a verse, with care and a fountain pen. Outside, frost was gathering again on the pavements. The choir's distant note floated through the air, pure, unwavering, and faintly discordant. I followed it with my eyes until it vanished into the night, leaving only silence and the faint scent of candle wax behind. There is a particular kind of silence that only libraries possess, the kind that feels less like absence and more like anticipation. The night I went back to Magdalen's library, the frost had tightened its grip on the windows, and the lamps along the cloistered path burned like small, patient sentinels. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. I had told him, truthfully enough, that I wanted to think. What I meant was that something in the case had begun to itch. an irritation too small to explain and too persistent to ignore. Inside, the library smelt of dust and disuse. The heating had been turned off, and my breath fogged faintly in the lamplight. I passed through aisles of books whose bindings were older than most of the truths Oxford pretended to keep. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a floorboard gave a reluctant sigh, as though remembering footsteps. Hargreaves' desk had already been cleared by the college porter, but I'd asked for it to remain unlocked. There were the usual relics of scholarship: ink bottle, magnifying glass, several volumes of Donne and Herbert, but also something unexpected: a small, index-sized card wedged between the pages of the anniversaries. It had been cut neatly along the edge, as if torn from a catalogue, and bore a faint penciled note. Immortality. Wrong entry. I turned it over. The reverse side was blank, except for a faint ring, the impression left by a coffee cup. It told me that the card had been handled recently, perhaps even during the final hours of Hargreaves' life. I slipped it into my notebook. On the table lay another volume, open and half-shadowed by the desk lamp, a collection of Donne's sermons. A line had been underlined twice in pencil: "The frost and the thaw are both God's instruments." It was a strange choice, neither poetic nor doctrinally central. What disturbed me was not its meaning, but its timing. The man who had fallen to his death on a frozen stair had, days before, marked a sentence about divine frost. I began to wonder whether scholarship here was ever just scholarship. Somewhere outside, a clock struck 12. The sound seeped through the windows like a reminder. I moved toward the catalogue cabinet, that peculiar piece of furniture that once contained all the order a mind could hope for. The drawers rattled faintly as I searched the I section. Hargreaves's card should have been there, between imitation and importunity. It wasn't. Someone had removed it and left a note about immortality being wrong. But why wrong? A small deduction surfaced then, fragile as the light it was born in. The handwriting on the penciled note did not match Hargreaves's. It was looped, more fluid, feminine perhaps. Claire Redding's script had that same particular tilt to the right, a trace of effort in each downward stroke, as if the hand were forcing the mind to appear calmer than it was. I could not be certain, but the resemblance was close enough to trouble me. I sat down in Hargreaves' chair, the wood cold beneath my palms, and thought about the kind of person who corrected catalogue cards. A perfectionist, yes, but also someone who believed in the authority of correction. The same sort of person who might alter a program note or rewrite a line of Donne to make it sound truer to her own despair. I stayed there longer than I meant to. The frost on the window began to bloom again, delicate patterns spreading outward like veins. In the dimness, the shelves seemed to close in, thousands of words standing in judgment over the one man who had spent his life worshipping them. When I finally left, I took the card with me. It felt lighter than it should have, as though it carried not knowledge, but absence. Outside, the bells of Magdalen chimed once more, low, deliberate, mournful, and as I crossed the courtyard, I found myself whispering that line again. The frost and the thaw are both God's instruments. It sounded less like faith than apology. It was one of those pale afternoons when the light seems to fade before it properly arrives, and Magdalen's quad looked more like a photograph than a place one might inhabit. Lewis and I had been asked to wait in the anteroom outside the choir vestry while the boys finished rehearsal. Through the door, I could hear their voices, thin, precise, and strangely unsettling in their purity. Music that perfect has never comforted me. It suggests obedience, not faith. When the rehearsal ended, the boys filed out 2 by 2, half whispering, half laughing. I caught the eye of the same fair-haired boy who had mentioned an argument earlier in the week, Benson. He hesitated, then tugged lightly at the hem of my coat. He said he couldn't talk in front of Dr. Ellison. I told him we might go for a walk, though in Oxford that always sounds like an invitation to confession. We went as far as the cloister garden. The ground was still frosted, and our breaths came out in twin plumes. He told me he hadn't been entirely honest before. The night Professor Hargreaves died, he had come back to fetch a forgotten music book. He had heard voices near the organ loft, two men arguing. One of them was angry, the other calm. Then came a noise. Not a fall exactly, more a sudden intake of silence. He looked frightened, saying it as though words themselves might summon the sound again. I asked whether he could recognize the voices. He said one was Dr. Ellison's, the other he wasn't sure of. Children, I've learned, are both better and worse witnesses than adults. They see too much and understand too little. But something in his tone, flat, almost dutiful, made me believe him. When I asked why he hadn't said this before, he muttered that Ellison had told them all to leave it to the grown-ups. Lewis rejoined us just then, holding a slip of paper the porter had given him. Someone had slid it under the vestry door earlier that morning. It contained only one line, typed neatly. No man is an island entire of himself. Yet some prefer the cold. The same sentence that had appeared in the anonymous note we'd received at the station. I read it several times. The punctuation was deliberate, the dash positioned where Don never placed one. The alteration turned philosophy into accusation, and whoever typed it had done so on an old machine. The R was faintly misaligned, an imperfection I recognized from the college's administrative office. A small deduction, but one that began to breathe. We thanked Benson and let him go. His footsteps vanished into the cloister, the echo falling too quickly for comfort. I told Lewis we would have to look into who still had access to a typewriter on the premises. He said that seemed a thin lead. I agreed. But in Oxford, thin leads are the only kind worth following. Before leaving, I stepped once more into the empty chapel. The sheet music from the previous night's rehearsal still lay scattered across the pews. One page had been torn neatly in half, the top missing altogether. On the remaining portion, a line of the hymn had been underlined in pencil. In frost and fire, thy servants find their trial. The mark was faint, deliberate, too knowing to be a child's. When I left, I glanced up toward the tower. The frost was returning, settling along the parapet where Hargreaves had died. It struck me then that the boy had described the sound of silence, the brief pause between two human voices, and not the sound of a fall. That was what had unsettled him. Not death, but interruption. I lit a cigarette outside the gates, the smoke thin against the evening air, and thought again of that phrase, "Some prefer the cold." It no longer felt like a metaphor. It was raining when I went to see her. Not the kind of rain that cleans the city, but the kind that settles in quietly, soaking stone and memory alike. Claire Redding lived in a narrow house off Iffley Road, a place so ordinary it almost felt like a disguise. The curtains were drawn despite the hour, and the hall smelled faintly of varnish and something else. Perhaps despair left too long unspoken. She answered the door as though she had been waiting for it. No surprise, no resistance, just a small flicker of resignation that could have been welcome or surrender. Her room was at the top of a thin staircase, a scholar's nest, shelves bowed under the weight of music scores and poetry volumes, a kettle perpetually ready, a window half open to the drizzle. On the desk lay a crossword, unfinished. I asked her if she minded my smoking. She shook her head. I didn't light one anyway. Some silences deserve oxygen. She told me she had been unable to sleep since Hargreaves' death. Not because of guilt, she added quickly, but because of the noise, the choir still practicing, the echo of his voice in the chapel. She described him the way one might describe a distant constellation, brilliant, unreachable, occasionally cruel in his brightness. He had once promised to help her publish a paper. Later, he had promised nothing at all. There was a photograph on her dresser, Hargreaves beside her at a conference, the kind of image that claims innocence by insisting too much upon it. I asked if she missed him. She said she missed what he made her feel intelligent, necessary, briefly unafraid. The phrasing was too precise to be spontaneous. On the desk, the crossword caught my eye again. The clue she'd paused on read, "Composer who froze his heart to hear truth. 6. She had written 3 letters, I, C, and E. I said nothing, though the coincidence struck me like a quiet bell. Beneath the paper, the corner of a folded photograph protruded. She noticed my glance, but did not move to hide it. I asked her where she had been on the night of the fall. She said she had gone walking after dinner toward the river, alone. The word arrived with hesitation, as if rehearsed too often. I asked whether she had seen Dr. Ellison that evening. She said she had not, though her voice betrayed the faintest tremor. I told her Ellison had spoken fondly of her scholarship. She replied that his fondness tended to wander. It was then I noticed the small detail that would stay with me, the smudge of typewriter ink on her left thumb. I pretended not to see it. The anonymous notes had been typed on a misaligned machine, one likely housed in the administrative office, where visiting scholars sometimes borrowed space. I wondered how often Claire had sat there, retyping her drafts or her regrets. Before leaving, I asked if I might use her kettle. While it boiled, she busied herself with the window latch. On the sill sat a potted violet, drooping but still alive. She touched it absently and said, almost to herself, that frost was a kind of mercy. It taught one what could not survive. I told her that frost, like grief, was less merciful than selective. It spared the shallow roots, killed the deep ones. She smiled at that, sadly, indulgently, as if she had expected no better from me. When I left, the rain had thickened into something almost solid. I walked toward the high, the crossword clue repeating itself in my mind. A frozen heart that heard truth. There was music in the phrasing, but also confession. Later that night, I checked the answer. Iceman, a childish word for something so bitterly adult. It was Lewis who found the letter, and I remember the peculiar stillness in his voice when he told me. He had been going through Hargreaves's pigeonhole at the lodge, expecting nothing more than college circulars and concert programs when he came upon the envelope, sealed, stamped, and dated the day after the professor's death. I took it from him in silence. The handwriting was unmistakable. Hargreaves' own, elegant, faintly archaic, a scholar's hand that still believed ink could preserve the truth. It was addressed to the provost, the paper thick and faintly yellowed, as if chosen to lend weight to what it carried. The porter swore no one had touched the mail since the morning after the fall. But I knew better. Oxford thrives on the gentle art of intervention. In my room at the station, I slit the envelope with a paper knife. The letter inside was brief, too brief for comfort. A single page, typed and signed with the same neat flourish I'd seen on Hargreaves's faculty memos. It accused Dr. Ellison of plagiarism, of stealing translations and claiming them as his own. Yet something in the phrasing disturbed me. The sentences were poised, grammatical, and coldly precise, and yet beneath that elegance, a rhythm was missing. I read it again, then a third time, the way one rereads a poem one doesn't quite understand. A phrase caught me. A crime against beauty. It was the kind of moral pronouncement Hargreaves might make after 2 glasses of port, but on paper it felt rehearsed, too aware of its own eloquence. Lewis asked whether I believed it genuine. I told him I wasn't sure. It had all the right signatures of truth and none of its soul. Forgery, I've learned, is less about imitation than about timing. Whoever wrote that letter had written it to be found, too late to be questioned, too perfect to be doubted. We brought it to the provost that evening. He was a frail, dry man, whose conversation consisted mostly of sighs. When I laid the letter on his desk, he peered at it as though inspecting a relic of some long-vanished faith. He said the accusation was impossible, that Ellison's scholarship was beyond reproach. Then he hesitated, only slightly, but enough. That hesitation was the sound of something cracking beneath the marble floor. After we left, Lewis and I walked through the quad in near darkness. The tower loomed above us, its frost beginning to thaw under a weak moon. He asked whether I thought Ellison had killed for reputation. I said reputation was a poor motive, but a very real one. Lewis smiled faintly. He knew I was thinking of Claire. That night I poured myself a whiskey and studied the letter once more under lamplight. The typewriter impression was faint on the lower half of the page, as though the ribbon had been worn. But one letter, the R, was faintly misaligned, identical to the defect in the anonymous note quoting Donna. I traced it lightly with my thumb, the way one touches an old scar. Someone had mimicked Hargreaves's diction with almost devotional care. They knew his cadences, his phrases, his indulgence in moral grandeur. Only one person I'd met so far possessed both the knowledge and the motive to compose such a thing. Yet what troubled me most was not the forgery itself, but its destination. Why the provost? Why not the press, or the university council, or Ellison himself? It wasn't meant to destroy. It was meant to warn. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it on my desk. The air in the room was cold enough for my breath to mist. I found myself repeating those words again, a crime against beauty, and wondering what sort of beauty was fragile enough to die for, and who among us decided what desecration meant. I didn't sleep that night. Outside, the first light of dawn began to dissolve the frost, and I thought, not for the first time, that truth in Oxford always arrives too late to matter. It was Lewis who suggested dinner at the Randolph. A small mercy, he called it, his way of prying me out of the cold. I'd been staring too long at the same lines in Hargreaves' letter, the words looping in my mind like a record with a scratch, a crime against beauty. I went along, more for the whiskey than the warmth. The restaurant was almost empty. Rain traced slow rivulets down the windows, and the chandeliers trembled slightly with each passing bus. I could tell Lewis was watching me over his menu. He said I hadn't eaten properly in days. I told him that men of my age survive on ideas and resentment. He said that might explain the circles under my eyes. When the wine came, it was a Burgundy, a 1964 Coton Clos du Roi. The waiter handled it reverently, as though serving confession in a glass. I noticed Lewis hesitate when he tasted it. It was excellent, too excellent, and for a moment I forgot the case entirely. Then I remembered. There had been Burgundy at Magdalen, the night of the choir rehearsal, a bottle reserved, according to the cellar record, for special guests. I asked Lewis how many had attended that supper. He said 5. Ellison, Claire, 2 faculty members, and Hargreaves. 1 bottle shared among them, nothing unusual. But I remembered Claire's admission. She'd fetched it for Ellison, not for the table. I told Lewis to look at the cellar book again, to check who had signed it out. He looked puzzled, but promised to do it. Then he asked whether I really believed wine could matter in a case like this. I said everything that stains matters. Later that night, I walked back alone through the mist toward the Botanic Garden. The gates were closed, but frost had crept through the bars like lace. Beyond them, the winter shrubs bent under the weight of their own silence. It was here, I think, that I began to understand. Not the crime, but its shape. Ellison and Hargreaves had argued about words, but what truly binds men like them is not rivalry. It is recognition. Each sees in the other the same defect, pride disguised as intellect. When such men share a bottle of wine, It is rarely communion. It is declaration. The next morning, I stood in the college cellar with Lewis. The air was damp and smelled of cork dust. On a narrow ledger, the entries were precise, each bottle accounted for, except one. The missing Burgundy had been signed out by Claire Redding 3 nights before the fall. She had written her initials, CR, in a hurried hand that bled slightly through the paper. I asked the steward if she had returned the bottle. He said she had not, though he had seen the empty in Dr. Ellison's office the next day. It was a small thing, a misplaced signature, a bottle that wandered between hands. But I felt the faint click of something aligning. In Oxford, the truth never announces itself. It only brushes past, like a stranger in fog. That evening I went again to the Randolph. I sat at the same table, ordered the same wine, and watched it bleed slowly into the glass. Burgundy. Dark, fragrant, faintly bitter. The color of guilt, if such a thing could be poured. Outside, the winter garden slept beneath a thin crust of ice. I thought of Claire's fingers smudged with typewriter ink, of Ellison's perfectly modulated voice, of Hargreaves's letter with its counterfeit grief. They were all, in their way, vintages of the same corruption, left too long uncorked. I lifted the glass and let the first sip rest on my tongue. Lewis had been right. I hadn't eaten properly in days, but the hunger that troubled me was not of the body. It was for the one thing Oxford never serves without consequence: truth in its most intoxicating form. It was late afternoon when I found myself once more outside Dr. Ellison's rooms, the air heavy with the scent of damp ivy and the faint echo of distant bells. The day had refused to brighten, as though the city itself were reluctant to witness what it already knew. I had been avoiding this visit, not for lack of courage, but for fear of what the man's voice might reveal when cornered by silence. He opened the door with an expression that hovered between civility and contempt. Inside, the fire burned low, and the faint crackle of a gramophone whispered some indistinct fragment of Schubert. Papers were arranged with a precision bordering on vanity. It was the room of a man who had mastered control, and I have always distrusted such rooms. He offered me a seat, wine, and conversation in that order. I declined 2 of them. I told him I'd been rereading Hargreaves' notes on Donne, and that one annotation had caught my attention, the correction of a line in a nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day. The word sleep replaced by silence. Ellison's eyes flickered only briefly, but the movement was enough to disturb the symmetry of his calm. He said he had never seen the manuscript. I told him I believed him, almost. There was a piece of music on the piano titled Elegy in Frost, the ink still fresh enough to glisten faintly in the firelight. It bore Hargreaves' name in pencil at the top, and beneath it another hand, Ellison's, had added a single line in blue ink, revised and completed. It was an odd phrase for a piece of mourning. I asked when he had written it. He said the morning after the accident, that the college had requested something suitable for the memorial. His voice was smooth, but his fingers, resting on the edge of the piano, betrayed a tremor. I told him the letter accusing him of plagiarism had arrived that same morning. For the first time since I had entered, the rhythm of the room faltered. He moved toward the decanter, pouring himself a measure of whiskey that sloshed slightly over the rim. I noticed then the faint smudge of blue ink on his thumb, the same shade as the correction on the score. He spoke of envy, of Hargreaves' brilliance, of the cruelty of a mind that needed no audience. He said they had been friends once, but that friendship in Oxford is an experiment conducted over too much wine and too little truth. I asked him whether he had argued with Hargreaves on the night of his death. He smiled thinly and said, men like Hargreaves did not argue, they pronounced. His tone was bitter, but beneath it I heard something quieter, almost reverent, that mixture of admiration and loathing that so often precedes ruin. On his desk lay the choir's printed program for the cancelled concert. I picked it up, pretending to study it. There, in the lower margin, someone had penciled a note. 2 words. Last verse. Ellison saw where my eyes had gone. He said it referred to the hymn, not to life. But as he spoke, the gramophone needle reached the end of the record, and the music ended in a long, unbroken hiss that filled the room like the aftertaste of guilt. I left him standing by the piano, the score still open, his hand resting on the page as though holding down the past. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. From the chapel came the faint murmur of a new rehearsal. The choir was practicing Don's verse again, the corrected one. I could just make out the line, "The frost and the thaw are both God's instruments." It struck me then that Hargreaves' death had been neither frost nor thaw, but the brittle place between them, the moment before a surface breaks. As I crossed the quad, I looked back at Ellison's window. A shadow moved behind the curtain, and for an instant I thought I heard the sound of a piano key pressed gently, a single note seeking absolution it would never find. The tower had always seemed to me an act of faith, too high, too slender, too perfect to have been built by men who doubted anything. Yet that evening, standing beneath its shadow, I felt how easily faith could crumble into geometry. The frost was already hardening along the parapets, a thin sheet of glass disguising every flaw. Lewis was waiting by the porter's gate. He said they'd finished clearing the scaffolding from the west side. We could climb now if I wished. I told him wishing had nothing to do with it. He followed, reluctantly, as I led the way up the narrow spiral, the stone steps worn down by centuries of feet and prayers. The higher we climbed, the colder the air became, until even our breath felt like part of the mist. At the top, Oxford stretched beneath us, dark roofs, thin chimneys, the faint glitter of the river winding like a vein through the city. From here, it was easy to imagine how a man might step too close to the edge, or be pushed just far enough to make it seem accidental. I leaned against the parapet, tracing with my eyes the shallow curve of the wall. There, on the northern corner, a faint mark remained, a scuff, almost invisible. Leather on stone. The final step of someone who had not meant to stop. Lewis muttered that it didn't look much. I said that most truths don't. What mattered was what wasn't there. No sign of struggle, no broken mortar, no misplaced handprint, as if the act itself had been conducted with courtesy. Below us, the city bells began their slow, overlapping dialogue. Ellison's choir was rehearsing in the chapel again, the same dawn setting that had haunted the case from the start. I could just make out the melody, carried upward on the air, the voices pure and deliberate. One note faltered briefly, then recovered. It was enough to make me turn. In the corner near the stairhead, half hidden beneath frost, something caught the lamplight, a fragment of glass. I crouched, brushing it free. It was from a spectacles lens, thin and curved, the edge faintly scratched. Hargreaves had worn spectacles, but his had been found unbroken beside his body. I held it up against the light. The fracture ran clean through the center. No shattering, just a quiet split, as if pressure rather than force had done it. I pocketed it without a word. Lewis asked what I'd seen. I told him the view was better from here. He didn't smile. We stayed a moment longer, the silence between us filled by the choir below. The final verse drifted upward. The frost and the thaw are both God's instruments. The line struck differently now. Hargreaves had written it, Ellison had altered it, and both men had believed themselves its author. I began to see the scene play out, not as confession or accident, but as conversation. A dispute measured not in shouts, but in syllables. 2 men standing here, one pleading for acknowledgement, the other for absolution, neither could give. Perhaps the push had been small, almost involuntary, the way one closes a door too firmly when the argument is done. Perhaps there had been no push at all. We descended without speaking. At the base, Lewis asked whether we'd ever prove it. I said proof was for courts, not for conscience. Later, alone, I placed the broken lens beside my whiskey glass and watched how the light fractured through it, a single imperfection turning everything it touched slightly askew. That, I thought, was the truest portrait of Oxford I had ever seen. Beautiful from a distance, merciless up close. Somewhere, beyond the window, the bells began again, marking the hour as though it mattered. And I wondered, as I often did, whether faith, like balance, was simply the art of pretending one will not fall. I remember the light that day, the peculiar stillness of an Oxford morning that promised snow, but never delivered it. The sky hung low over the city like a sheet of unplayed music. I was back in Magdalen's chapel, though not for worship. Ellison had asked to see me. The choir was rehearsing again, their voices threading through the arches with that unnerving perfection that belongs only to the innocent and the damned. He sat near the organ, his hands clasped, the faintest tremor in his fingers. The man who had conducted hundreds of performances now seemed afraid of silence. I told him there was no need to speak unless he wished to. He replied that wishing was irrelevant. One does not wish to breathe. The confession came not as speech, but as release, a slow unspooling of sentences that seemed to have been rehearsed privately for years. He said Hargreaves had been his rival, yes, but more than that, his mirror, that he had loved the man's brilliance and despised his certainty. They had worked together on the Dawn translations. Hargreaves, he said, believed truth was a solitary pursuit. Ellison had believed it was communal. Between them, faith became performance. He described the night of the fall as though reciting a score. The argument, the frost, the tower. Hargreaves had accused him of theft, of spiritual cowardice, of vanity disguised as piety. Ellison said he'd only reached out to steady him, to stop him walking so close to the edge. His hand had found cloth, then nothing. For a moment, the sound of the choir drowned out his words, the boys above us singing, "No man is an island entire of himself." When the music faded, he whispered that perhaps he had wanted it to happen. Not consciously, but in that small, irredeemable part of a man that craves quiet. He said the fall was less a murder than a relief. I told him that relief can be the cruelest form of sin. He smiled, thinly, gratefully. He produced something from his coat, a single sheet of music, folded and refolded until the creases nearly split it. Elegy and Frost, the same piece I had seen before. Beneath Hargreaves' name, the words revised and completed by J.E. remained. He handed it to me without a word, and I understood it for what it was. Not a confession, not an absolution, but a relic. Proof that beauty, too, could be complicit. Outside, the bells of Magdalen began their hour. Ellison rose, straightened his cuffs, and said he had a rehearsal to conduct. I told him that the rehearsal was over. He said, "No, Inspector, not yet." Then he walked toward the choir, the hem of his robe trailing lightly across the flagstones, like a shadow that had forgotten its owner. The police statement that followed later was clean, precise, utterly unremarkable. An accident witnessed by none, admitted by one who wished only for quiet. Oxford would believe it. The university always believes in decorum more than guilt. That evening, I stood once more beneath the tower. Snow had begun to fall, fine as dust, dissolving on the stones where Hargreaves had died. Through the chapel window, the choir's final verse rose into the dark. The frost and the thaw are both God's instruments. I wondered whether Ellison had chosen it as punishment or prayer, perhaps both. Lewis joined me briefly. He said it was over now. I told him it never is. He looked puzzled, then left me to my thoughts. The last note of the hymn drifted outward, thinning in the air until it vanished entirely. I imagined it traveling upward through the cold, beyond the tower, beyond the reach of confession, and I thought of Hargreaves and of Ellison, and of how every act of beauty carries its own crime, waiting patiently to be heard. Spring came late that year. Oxford thawed slowly, as though uncertain whether it still deserved warmth. The first crocuses appeared in the college gardens, hesitant splashes of colour between the stones, and the tower, Magdalen's proud sentinel, stood cleansed of frost at last. I remember standing beneath it one morning, my coat unbuttoned, my breath no longer visible, and thinking how strange it was that something so heavy could look newly innocent. The case, if one could still call it that, was finished in every official sense. Ellison had resigned, Claire had left her lodgings on Iffley Road without farewell, and the choir sang on as though sound could erase memory. Lewis said the file should be closed. I said nothing. Some truths don't need locks. They simply fade until only the echo remains. There were mornings when I told myself it had all been inevitable, that pride and beauty were destined to destroy one another in this city of immaculate facades. But at night, when the bells shivered through the mist, I found I still saw Hargreaves' face, his spectacles folded neatly beside the body, his hand reaching for something just beyond my understanding. A week after Ellison's confession, I received a parcel with no sender's name. Inside lay a single page of manuscript, the final bars of Elegy in Frost, rewritten in Hargreaves' own hand. The ink was blurred by what might have been moisture, or time, or both. Beneath the music, he had scrawled a phrase, "To be sung when the thaw begins." I read it several times before realizing what disturbed me most. The handwriting slanted left, not right. Claire's had done the same. Perhaps she had copied it after his death, perhaps not. In Oxford, authorship is rarely simple. I placed it in my desk drawer beside the broken lens and tried to let it go. Lewis stopped by the flat that evening with a bottle of decent scotch and the awkward cheer of a man who believes work can drown conscience. He said the inquest had returned its verdict, accidental death, unanimously. Ellison had accepted a post abroad. I asked whether he seemed relieved. Lewis said he seemed lighter, and I suppose that was close enough. After he left, I poured a measure of the whiskey and watched the light move across the glass. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, and the city looked washed clean, its sins politely rinsed and put away. I thought of Claire again, her voice in the choir, her hands ink-stained and steady. I wondered whether she sang still, or whether she had found silence easier to bear. There's a peculiar cruelty in beauty that endures beyond its witness. The tower stood immaculate. The frost had melted, but not the stain it left behind. I had solved the case, yes, or something close to it, but I couldn't escape the sense that the truth had merely changed shape, thawed into water and slipped away through cracks I hadn't known to watch. I went walking through the city after midnight, the streets empty except for the soft glimmer of lamps reflected on wet stone. From Magdalen, faint music drifted across the air, a choir rehearsing late, or perhaps memory replaying itself. The melody was familiar, the same line, corrected, perfected, sung one last time. The frost and the thaw are both God's instruments. I stopped beneath the tower and listened until the final chord dissolved. It wasn't absolution I heard, nor guilt. Something quieter, like a breath released after too long, held. When the wind shifted, the scent of damp magnolia reached me from the college garden, and for the first time in months, I thought not of death, but of endurance. The frost had gone, the tower remained, and somewhere between the two, perhaps, lay the fragile mercy of forgetting.